It's crazy how we are in an environment and a time where cameras that cross over that 3-month age range are considered old. Regardless of age, both the a6400 and the M50 Mark II have strengths and weaknesses, and I want to shine a light on those differences to help you if you're in the market for a new camera. I recently did a comparison video between the M50 Mark II and the ZV-E10 and was surprised to see a lot of you thought the M50 Mark II had a better image quality. On the heels of that video, I compared the ZV-E10 to the a6400 and was surprised to see a lot of you thought the a6400 had a better image quality than the ZV-E10. So that only makes sense for me to compare the winners of both of those matchups to each other for the ultimate championship. I'll leave a link in the description for both of those videos, but for now, let's proceed forward with the Sony a6400 versus the Canon M50 Mark II. One of my greatest joys when I put together a video like this is to see what you guys like better and why, so please let me know in the comment section. As you probably know, both of these cameras are beginner cameras, but the real question is which one is a better beginner camera? I remember getting my first camera and literally not knowing how to use it, so that's the lens that I'm going to put on as this video unfolds. We don't want to forget about the beginners. I rented both the a6400 and the Canon M50 Mark II from Lens Rentals, and I've never owned either of them, but I thoroughly tested them out in real-world situations to give you better purchasing power. The lenses that I'll be using for both of these tests are as follows. On the a6400, we have the kit lens, the 16 to 50mm f3.5 to 5.6, and the 35mm f1.4. For the Canon, we have the EF 15 to 45 f3.5 to 6.3 and the Sigma 30mm f1.4. Specs are important, but what's more critical to me is the usability, the workflow, and the image quality. Specs help tell a story, but it's not always the whole story. When I lay the specs out, I also remember to try to tell you why or why not they might be important to you in whatever situation you find yourself in. So as I have already mentioned, we know who these cameras are marketed towards. The M50 Mark II and the a6400 are both marketed towards beginners, hybrid shooters, vloggers, and content creators. But ultimately, I would say both of these cameras are for beginners who want to learn more about how to use a camera if they want to become involved in this niche. Just because they're called beginner cameras, that by no means would stop me from using them on pro client shoots. I used to shoot all of my videos, even professional client shoots, with my phone, so I know these cameras have a lot of potential. Out of the gate, both of these cameras would be great for photographers because they both have an electronic viewfinder and a 24 megapixel sensor. It's super helpful to get your framing right when you're out in the field and you don't have to rely on your display, especially when you're in a sunny environment and your screen is greasy from finger oils. It would be pretty annoying if you get home and realize you messed up the framing or the focus just because you couldn't really see the 3-inch display. Before we take a deep dive into the differences between both of these cameras, I'm going to list the similarities for you so that we know what we're working with. Both cameras are APS-C cameras. They can interchange lenses. They have similar form factor, a built-in flash. They take the same SD card, weigh around the same. Both have an electronic viewfinder, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, a micro HDMI, mic input, auto and manual focus, 24 megapixel sensors, 3-inch articulating touchscreens, Hotshoes. They can shoot time-lapse, and they both do not have ND filters. Now that's not all the similarities, but some of the similarities we need to take a closer look at. As I mentioned, both the a6400 and the M50 Mark II are APS-C cameras. The difference, however, is the Sony crops in 1.5 times and the Canon crops in 1.6 times. If I was to put a 20mm lens on the end of the a6400, that would give me a 30mm lens equivalent. And if I did that same lens on the Canon, that would give me a 32mm full frame equivalent. Now, it's not that big of a difference, but it is something to consider as you purchase lenses. Did I say ZV-E10 again? I made an entire video comparing full frame and APS-C, and I'll link that video in the description in case you need any clarification. Now with that said, what's more important to me is the colors out of the camera for filmmaking, photography, and the image quality, especially in low light. The a6400 is advertised to have between 12 and 13 stops of dynamic range, and the Canon M50 Mark II has been tested to have 13.4 stops of dynamic range. But when I was doing the research on this, I found information from all different types of sources and it was all over the place. So since I don't know how to calculate dynamic range scientifically, I say we just look at the side-by-side images from here through the rest of the video and you can be the judge of that. If you're interested in how to correctly expose your camera or use aperture priority, I made a video for each of those topics and I'll leave those in the description as well. This leads me to the next real-world question for you. What if you understand all of the exposure principles, but the display is not sharp enough or articulating enough to put your skills to use? Here at the Film Alliance, I think we can all agree that one of the hardest parts about creating a video is finding the right music that perfectly complements the story you are trying to tell. You want it to be perfect, and you want it to carry the viewer seamlessly through the end of the video. Track Club allows you to do this by being able to infinitely customize the stems of any song, muting or soloing instruments, adjusting volume levels, and speeding up or slowing the BPM to match the energy of the video. It gives you a greater level of creative control over your sound, all without leaving your browser. The first step in my creative process is deciding what filters match the vibe I'm going for or a particular part of a video. I've been able to take my videos to a whole new level since I started using Track Club. Try it out for yourself. I'll leave a link in the description for a free, full access 2-month trial. Now back to our video. Something to consider is that the a6400 does not have a full 360-degree articulating LCD screen. It does, however, have a 180-degree tilting touchscreen. This definitely gives an advantage to the M50 Mark II, which has a fully articulating display, which is super helpful, especially when you do headshots like this one, so you can actually see your frame before pressing record. I did have this issue while I was using the a6400. Doing some of these tests, the little screen that flips up on top, it was being blocked by the EVF, and I didn't get my framing right, and I had to reshoot that scene. The LCD screen on the M50 Mark II has 1.04 million dots, and the a6400 has 921,600. So I know the popular view here is that it doesn't really matter, but to me it does. If you're not hooked up to an external monitor and you want to make sure you're nailing focus, then this is a pretty big deal. But I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker. In the past, I've come home from shoots where I looked at the footage that I got using the display only and found out that I was a little bit out of focus, or my focus window was a lot smaller than I thought it was, and it was a lot of unusable footage. So when it comes to the amount of dots that's on the display or how sharp the display is, I think that's pretty important. This would go to the M50 Mark II. Now let's talk about the outside of the camera. The more physical buttons and dials you have, the better, in my opinion, because the more buttons and dials you have, the more customization you can implement. In turn, the faster you can be efficient out in the field and have better creative workflow. When you're out shooting with a camera that has a lot of buttons and dials, you can easily find what you're looking for instead of searching through the menu system. First off, the a6400 has more buttons than the M50 Mark II. Secondly, for me, the a6400 is easier to navigate because all of the cameras that I've used are Sony cameras, so I'm used to that Sony layout. When I'm using a different brand of camera like the Canon or the Sigma, my muscle memory will automatically click buttons as if it were a Sony camera, and then I get messed up. Because I'm used to that Sony layout, and because the a6400 has more buttons, I'm gonna give this to the a6400. But I can't put myself into a beginner's mindset with this one. I do think either of these cameras' buttons and dials won't make that big of a difference. If you're a beginner and you just go out there and you're not used to either camera, you'll probably just get used to the buttons that are on the outside of the camera. So I don't think it should be a problem with whatever camera you decide on. In my ZV-E10 vs M50 Mark II video, I mentioned that because the M50 Mark II has an EVF and the ZV-E10 does not, the Canon came out on top by far. An EVF makes a night and day difference, but unfortunately, and also fortunately, both of these cameras have an EVF, so we cannot base our decision on which one of these two cameras is better purely on the EVF, which means we'll have to talk about the image quality and the sensor's color science. Both cameras have a 24 megapixel sensor, but the way that the sensors read out the colors are different from each other, which makes them unique. This comes down to personal preference on what colors you like better. Whenever I compare two images between two different cameras, I always look at how the greens and the reds look and how real to life they look. Are there any hues or tones each one of the cameras have? Honestly, this was a really hard decision for me, and I'd love to hear your opinion on which one of these two cameras you like better. One thing that I will say is that the M50 Mark II has digital stabilization and the a6400 has none, which gives an advantage to the M50 Mark II when it comes to photography. But with video, I tested out the stabilization on the Canon M50 Mark II and the a6400, and honestly, they both were just not that good. But we'll get more into stabilization later in the video. So if we want a definitive answer, then we would say, let's probably look at the color science and see which one will come out on top in your opinion. But I think this is a very subjective question, so I'm leaving that one up to you. Both viewfinders are extremely helpful, especially in bright environments for both video and photos, and macro photography, especially when you need to nail focus, like we talked about in the past. The a6400 has 2,359,296 dots in the viewfinder, and the M50 Mark II has 2,360,000 dots, which is only a 704 dot difference. Now, it doesn't seem like a very big deal, and it's not. When I was out in the field using it, I didn't notice a difference either way. And because of that reason, both cameras tie. Both cameras have one mounting point and one hot shoe. You can use the hot shoe on the top for an external mic and the mounting point on the bottom to mount your camera to tripods, mounting plates, and gimbals. The mounting point on the bottom of the Canon is really close to that battery door, so if you're interested in mounting your camera to different things, then go with the a6400. This will make it a lot easier to change out the battery and SD cards so you don't have to unmount your entire setup just to change out the battery. Another thing that I would recommend is to pick up a cage with whatever camera you go with. The first accessory that I always purchase is a cage, not only to help me build out the camera a bit more, but to give the camera a better grip and protection in case I drop it. Another thing to keep in mind is that the hot shoe on the a6400 is off to the left side, whereas if you wanted to put a top handle on the Canon M50, it would be nice and balanced. Both cameras have a micro HDMI, micro USB, and mic ports. The M50 Mark II has its micro HDMI and micro USB port on the right side of the camera where the hand grip is. So if you wanted to use these while you were shooting, it would make it very difficult to hold the camera, especially if you're recording externally to a monitor. Both cameras do not have headphone ports, but you can use the audio level meter inside of the display. But that doesn't tell you too much about the audio, just the level. It doesn't let you know if you have any interference or hissing in the background, which you won't find out about until you get home and start the post process. If you did want a headphone port for whatever camera you chose, then I would say go with a similar APS-C camera like the ZV-E10. Instead of talking about the audio straight out of the camera, let's just listen and you can be the judge on which one you think has a better native mic. Don't mind the framing on this one for the Canon M50 Mark II. I was so focused on the audio test that I forgot that the lens was a little zoomed up. Here's the a6400 and we're testing out the native audio inside of the camera to see how it sounds compared to the Canon M50 Mark II. I'm using the kit lens on the ZV-10 and the kit lens on the Canon M50 II. Let's see what this one sounds like. Now we're doing a native audio test out of the Canon M50 II to see how it sounds compared to the Sony ZV-E10. I always recommend purchasing an external mic setup because that will always sound much better than the native audio that's inside of the cameras. But if you don't have the budget to buy an external mic, then the native audio out of both of these cameras will get you by. A big difference between these cameras is the in-body stabilization. The a6400 does not have any in-body stabilization, whereas the M50 Mark II does. Although if you have a lens on the a6400 that has stabilization, you could switch on steady shot, which helps a tad but not a lot. A wider lens will produce a lot smoother footage than shooting handheld. The M50 Mark II does have electronic stabilization, but I would recommend picking up a gimbal for both cameras if it's in your budget. When it comes to handheld shooting, I would go with the M50 Mark II because of its stabilization feature. Also, if you're picking up a lens, I would say purchase one that has OSS or stabilization inside of the lens if you plan on doing any type of handheld shooting for both cameras. Both cameras do have rolling shutter due to their electronic shutter, which is especially noticeable when you're shooting with longer lenses. You're never going to do this with the camera, but it's nice to know if you're shooting a moving object like when you're driving or pointing the camera outside and everything just looks rubbery to see what the rolling shutter looks like. If you're shooting with the zoom lens, I highly recommend you pick up a monopod like the YC Onion Pinetta to stabilize that rolling shutter better. If you want to know more about the YC Onion monopod, I actually made a video about it and I'll leave that one in the description as well. If shooting in 4K 24, the advertised recording limit for the a6400 is 80 minutes, while the advertised recording limit for the M50 Mark II is 130 minutes. Definitely giving the M50 Mark II a huge advantage. If you're only shooting vlogs or short form videos, this shouldn't be a problem. I think this would pose a problem for someone who wants to use these cameras in professional work, but I would be more concerned about overheating than the recording limits in these small camera bodies, especially if you want to record something longer like a podcast. When it comes to overheating, the smaller body of the M50 Mark II has no internal fan and has an unpopular reputation for overheating, especially in warmer climates. It is said to overheat in warm temperatures after about 30 minutes of shooting. I didn't have any issues when it came to overheating with the M50 Mark II, and I didn't even get any warning signs. The a6400 also does not have an internal fan, but does not seem to have that same reputation for overheating issues like the M50. The low light performance of both cameras will be relatively the same because they're both APS-C cameras. I've heard that the base ISO out of the a6400 is ISO 100 when shooting S-Log3, and the base ISO out of the Canon Mark II is also 100. Also, something to keep in mind is I start to see a grain once I start to get into that 1600 range of ISO. The ISO range for the a6400 is 100 to 32,000, while the M50 Mark II is 100 to 12,800. Both cameras have different picture profiles users can choose from if they want to get the most out of their picture through the color grading process. I shot straight out of the camera for all of the video shots that you saw in these comparisons because I was trying to keep the beginner in mind. They're not going to jump into picture profiles. We just want to know what the cameras look like straight out of the box. On a plus side, the a6400's body is weather sealed for moisture and dust. The M50 Mark II has no weather sealing, so while it might make a great travel camera, be mindful of the weather conditions before you walk out the door. This is definitely something to keep in mind when going out to shoot in rainy and snowy environments. They both have autofocus and manual focus, but I don't care what anyone says, the autofocus out of the a6400 was way better in my tests. Maybe there's a setting inside the M50 Mark II that I missed, but it definitely beat the M50 Mark II in both photos and video. Face tracking, locking onto what I wanted it to lock onto, it was a lot easier to use. I actually had to throw the M50 Mark II into manual focus on a couple shots in rack focus like the olden day cameras, which made it a little bit frustrating, but at the same time it gave me more control and I kind of liked it. Both cameras take one SD card, which will make it difficult if you're hoping to have that backup card reader. You can always purchase an Atomos Ninja 5 or another monitor that can record your footage as a backup that has its own media built inside of it, but that would put you back another $500 to $700 just to have that redundancy. This is definitely a big disadvantage for both cameras, especially if you want to use them for professional work. For real world use, I used both cameras and I was pretty surprised to see how much longer the M50 Mark II battery lasted compared to the a6400. But here's a huge advantage to the a6400 over the M50 Mark II, and that is that you can charge the a6400 battery via the micro USB cable, whereas the M50 Mark II, you have to take the battery physically out of it and charge it on the wall charger. This poses a problem, especially if you're traveling and you forgot your charger at home. Both cameras can interchange lenses, which is a factor you want to take into consideration compared to, say, a point-and-shoot camera like the ZV-1, which has a built-in lens. Do you have extra money in your budget for better lenses? The M50 Mark II does come with a kit lens at that $599 price point, which is great, but the Canon M50 Mark II also has a Canon EFM lens mount, and currently there are only 29 native lenses available for this mount, whereas there are hundreds of E-mount lenses, which is why I would go with the a6400. If you want a wider selection of lenses at a cheaper price, go with the a6400, because the more lenses that are available, the cheaper they become due to supply and demand. You have to ask yourself, what are you planning on shooting? You can clearly cross over both cameras for different uses. You can use the a6400 as a vlog camera and the M50 Mark II to shoot sports and wildlife. If you plan on making talking head YouTube videos or vlogging, then I would go with the a6400. And if you plan on shooting both video and photos, then I would go with the M50 Mark II. Remember that if you're on a budget, you're going to want to go with the a6400 because the lens options will be a lot cheaper. Also, there are a lot more lens options for the a6400 than the Canon M50 Mark II. That can be a huge advantage, especially if you want to take your videos to the next level. Overall, they're both great cameras and you won't go wrong with either of them. I hope this video helps you make a better purchasing decision. I'd like to know what you like better and why. I personally own only Sony cameras and stay in that ecosystem because I'm afraid to venture out into the Canon waters, but I know it's always good to explore. I guess I just don't want to get lost. I'm Joe with the Film Alliance, and until we meet again, I'll see you on the next video.